Okay. Many of you already know Jonti, but I'm going to read his short bio anyway for those who have not had the pleasure of knowing him. Jonti's a fifth generation naval man, served in the Royal Navy from 1974 to 2006. He joined various ships from minesweepers to carriers before finding his meter in submarines in 1978. After initial qualification appointments, he specialized in navigation in 1981 and saw action in the Falklands as a navigation officer on HMS Conqueror. Passing Perisher in 1986, he was posted as command rider to HMS Splendid and then XO on HMS Resolution. He subsequently commanded His Majesty's ship Unseen, Resolution, and Victorious. Once ashore, he served as follows: the UK Embassy in DC from 97 to 99, MOD in London, 99 to 02, NATO 02 to 06, where he ran the International Submarine Rescue Working Group from 2002 to 2006. He attained his first degree in physics and astronomy in 2006, shortly after leaving the service. In 2006, Jonti left the Royal Navy early and joined Rolls-Royce Submarines to lead development of the new submarine rescue system for the UK, France, and Norway, based in Scotland. On completion, he left Rolls-Royce in 2015 and set up himself as a maritime contractor in his own company. He is currently the ops director of the Britannia Maritime Aid. He has been published on various maritime subjects and made several TV and radio programs as a presenter, talking head. He is an enthusiastic supporter and fundraiser for the Sea Cadets, is vice president of TS Unseen, and has been president of TS Glory, treasurer of TS Enterprise, and currently the president of TS Kenya in Derby. Since 2012, Jonti has lived in Swanwick, Derbyshire, with his wife Maggie, plus stay-at-home daughter Amy, and recently divorced son Leo, and Sophie the Staffy. Older daughter McGann lives in New South Wales with her family. All three offspring went to sea, but only Leo is still seagoing in the Merchant Navy. He is now the custodian of his great-great-grandfather's sextant. Jonti and Maggie have 5 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, plus a step-granddaughter spread from Australia to Derby. Interests in steam railways, let's see, naval history, astronomy, opera, cars, a DB9, 1939 Austin 7 and a Volvo V70, rowing, sailing, and shooting. He doesn't decorate or garden unless he's forced to. Jonti, over to you.
Well, thank you again, George. Well, the slide you can see now is actually July the 4th, 1982, us returning and flying the Jolly Roger, which has been a tradition in the Royal Navy since the first sinking of a German cruiser in 1914. It was commented on at the time quite a lot. I don't think people appreciate the sometimes black sense of humor that we have, but there was a period in the
Jonti, I think I just muted you for some reason, somehow.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Is that correct?
Yeah, you're muted now, yes.
Okay, well, I'm not sure which bit you muted, but the flying of the Jolly Roger has long been a submarine tradition. What I'm going to talk about, essentially, recognizing that many of the audience are from the United States, and indeed this is intended as going on record within the United States. I'm going to talk briefly about some of the differences in the way we conduct ourselves. I'm also going to talk about me in the state of the Navy as it was in the early 80s. I shall briefly describe both of the protagonists, Belgrano and the Conqueror, and then go on to the attack, and in particular, some aspects of the weapon choices we made. The outcomes clearly are towards the end of this, and I expect that I will speak for something between 45 and 60 minutes, depending on how garrulous I feel. But questions and answers, please wait until the end. But if there's any immediate queries, if you use the chat facility, I may be able to pick them up and work them into what I'm saying. That is my email at the bottom of the screen, shipmate@aol.com. I'm very happy to take questions or further questions privately and on the internet. So firstly, let's just think about the differences, because I've found when I'm delivering this in the past that it's very easy to dodge over some of the things which are fundamentally different. And I suppose one of the key ones is that since about 1919, the Royal Navy has not had line officers. We did have for a while under the revolution of Jackie Fisher, but it was found that the engineers thought themselves second class, and it was a black, it was considered a black mark on you if you were not on the command stream. They may or may not have been right. And there are some people who enjoy engineering and some people who don't. But we don't have line officers, and so we have specialists we refer to as the executive or warfare branch, which is what I was in, marine engineering, which is principally propulsion, weapon engineering, which is a separate discipline, and then there's also logistics. Another thing which I've always found a surprise is that in the UK, we don't seem to value education to the same degree that you do in the United States. And one of the things I found very impressive indeed about working in the United States from the embassy and working in the Pentagon was the number of people who were not just on their first degree, but on their second or sometimes even third degree. Your Navy makes space for people to do that. It's really quite hard in my Navy to do that. And indeed, as George said, I didn't get my first degree until on the point of leaving the Navy. And that was physics and astronomy, largely because they were the subjects I enjoyed. Although it was very useful working in Rolls-Royce, which is absolutely chock-a-block with engineers, to be able to argue the toss, because I had a more specific degree than theirs. Not that astronomy was a great deal of use in the submarine world. Another difference, which I think has changed since the 1980s, was that the first lieutenant, the XO, in a British nuclear submarine is command qualified. He will usually, nowadays, have come straight from the Perisher command course into the second in command role. And he is in every way a deputy to the captain. And it has happened where British submarines have injured a captain and the captain has been lifted off and the first lieutenant left alone, essentially in command, to get on with it. I believe now you do the same. We also have a different watch system. British nuclear submarines are 6 on, 6 off throughout, and their two key officers are the navigating officer and the tactics and sonar officer. I believe their names or their titles have changed since I was a lad, but I was the navigator, so I had effectively charge is perhaps a little bit of an overstatement, but I ran the submarine for 2 6-hour watches every day. And when I wasn't doing it, the sonar officer did it. And we had our own teams. And although the engineering department was not in 2 watches, it meant that the watch itself was manned sufficiently to handle just about everything, with the possible exception of a weapon firing. Now, I mentioned that I would talk about the mood of the RN because it was a difficult time. In 1979, Margaret Thatcher became the first female prime minister of the country and took over a country which was in a bad shape. The previous Labour or socialist government had essentially wrecked the economy, spent too much money, overtaxed people, and were punishing enterprise. And the armed forces were going through a strange set of irrational changes and reductions in numbers. And I mentioned here a key point was the fact that compared to industry, pay rates in the armed forces had fallen quite markedly in the 1970s. Although we still did have, at this stage, politicians who were old enough to have actually served in a shooting war, there weren't very many of them. And the knowledge of politicians concerning the services, in particular the submarine service, which is necessarily always a little bit mysterious, there wasn't a great deal of knowledge. And you always had a sense of, well, when you met members of the parliament, they were asking the sort of fundamental questions which you would have thought that they would have been briefed on beforehand. And also with the end of the British Empire and the retreat from imperial power, we'd gone through a lot of cuts. I mean, I joined a navy with 70 frigates, 75,000 people, and I left the navy in 2006 with 25 frigates and escorts and 12 submarines. Whereas when I joined submarine service, I think there were still 32 submarines in the Royal Navy. And those cuts, I mean, 1964 was a classic when we decided we would no longer have fixed wing aircraft carriers, although of course by 1982 we'd reversed that change. And in the early 70s, the bankrupt state of the country meant that we just chopped 1/7 of the Navy with no rational purpose other than to save money. And what made it worse was a lot of people were expecting things to change radically when the Conservatives under Thatcher became members or became the government. But John Knott, the Defence Secretary, had a cutting review in 1981, which would have disposed of our carriers immediately. At the time, we only had two, one of the little new ones, the Invincible and Hermes, not a particularly large carrier. And we were also going to get rid of our amphibious capability, which meant the Marines would become part of the army. And the Royal Navy was essentially to be little more than escorts for NATO and the United States Navy. And frankly, morale was fragile. And certainly in some of the engineering branches, there was an exodus building up. The Australian Navy was also struggling with submariners and were openly poaching our people. And the Canadian nuclear program was interesting. And a lot of engineers were leaving nuclear submarines to go to Canada to operate CANDU and other similar programs. So my point here really is that this was not a time when we were comfortable with ourselves. We were being challenged in many ways, and challenges consume time, effort, and to a certain extent, take your eye off the ball of what was really important. So that was the situation way back then. And it was one, of course, which I'd, having been in the Navy at this stage for, 8 years, I was essentially used to this sort of air of decline and second classness almost, by which I mean our sort of status within the country. But this picture is, I think, an interesting picture in that there is USS Phoenix on the 7th of December, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, on her way out, I believe, because she was a cruiser, she was left alone by the Japanese during the attack and was on her way to act as part of the escort team for the carriers, which had been delivering aircraft to Midway. And what a good job that accident happened, because otherwise the Pacific War would probably have taken a lot longer to have reconciled. As I was explaining earlier, the definition light cruiser might seem odd for something which is over 13,000 tons, but a light cruiser by the London and Washington conventions on fighting ships. A light cruiser was a ship with guns of 6-inch bore or less. Heavy cruisers had 8 inches. If you had a cruiser with more than an 8-inch, it technically became a battleship. During the First World War, certainly in the Royal Navy, we had cruisers with 9-inch guns, which effectively were small sort of second-class battleships. But by the time the Second World War started, it was pretty well established that cruisers were either light or heavy, and there was nothing in between. Now, this was an armored ship, and this is an important point to make, because by 1982, there were very, very few armored ships left in anybody's navy. The Type 42 destroyer, which was our principal anti-aircraft escort, had pretty much no armor. There was a limited amount of splinterproofing internally, but certainly there was nothing in a ship like that which would keep out a 6-inch shell. And a 4-inch belt armor and 3-inch deck made this ship pretty much impervious to the guns that ships did have. The standard British gun was a 4.5-inch gun firing a shell which weighed about 45 pounds and would lob it about 20,000 yards. But a 6-inch gun, and especially a ship like this with 15 6-inch guns, would have been a very difficult thing to manage from the point of view of keeping it at bay or sinking it. And indeed, pretty much the only option that you would have had to deal with such a ship was either bombardment from the air, but very few of our bombs were armor-piercing bombs. Again, the demise of armored ships meant we didn't need armored bombs. And it would probably have been a submarine task, as indeed it became. Now, the ship itself had been in Argentine service for quite a long time, purchased in the early 1950s, renamed at least once, and General Belgrano himself was a hero of the early 19th century when Argentina was essentially created from having been the Republic on the Plate or a Spanish colony. It then was established around 1816, 1817. And indeed, there was a war with the British at about that time, which they actually won. But that was in the 18 teens. But that was the Phoenix or the Belgrano, a difficult thing for us to handle. Now, HMS Conqueror, although she was actually the fourth of the five, there were 3 C-class nuclear submarines, which after Dreadnought, Valiant and Warspite was our 3rd attempt to build a nuclear submarine. The differences were pretty slight. She was not a particularly quiet submarine. Some of our steam plant was hardened. Our turbo feed pumps were hard fixed to the hull and made a hell of a lot of noise in the full power state. She was 4,500 tons dived. Her maximum speed was in the vicinity of 28 knots. But when we did not have a recoverable towed array, so we had to tow the towed array about a mile long, and that cost us a knot, maybe even a knot and a half. We also had an unmodernized fire control system. So it was all graphs, plotting, both vertically and horizontally, and interpreting and calculating 1959 ranges and such like. We could handle easily 2 chains of fire. We had a machine for firing the Mark 24 torpedo, and we also had essentially a British copy of the old American electromechanical computer about the size of a fridge freezer, which stood in the corner of the control room. And you had handles and an electric motor which drove this massive pile of cogs and wheels, which gave you solely a course to steer for the torpedoes. And we carried quite a lot of torpedoes. We had racks for 34, and actually we had racks for 2 more, but it was always standard to keep at least 1 rack and 1 tube empty so that you could shuffle and decide what to actually put into the tubes. We had 6 torpedo tubes, so we could actually have a mixed salvo, or a mixed load rather, of Mark 8s, usually fired in 3s and 4s, and the Mark 24 Mod 1 usually fired singly. In later boats, it was capable of being fired in pairs. But the boat itself had been in service since the early 70s. We had a working crew of 98, although we normally took to sea with us about 120. Deep diving depth was only 750 feet. And for a reason that I've never really learnt, every time we went below 500 feet, we had to record exactly how deep we'd gone, how long we spent down there, and whether or not we went up and down below 500 feet. I really would love to know why we had to do that. But eventually they stopped asking us to do it, which was a blessing, frankly. But 750 feet does not give you much. And an important aspect of these submarines, note the fin is very tall, that if you are going at speed and you put the rudder hard over, the boat went into a strange gyration where you would suddenly find the boat heeling and the rudder then starting to act like a stern plane, because sometimes the angle reached would be over 30 degrees and the boat would plunge in depth, and you would very quickly lose 200 or 300 feet in depth. It was quite a skill to actually these submarines, in that you had to actually get the bow up before you started to turn. Used to frighten people that had never seen it before. But there were issues on board as well. The captain had joined the submarine on around the 9th of March. And we were actually in a maintenance availability. And that was the standard way that British submarines ran. We would do roughly 11 weeks of operations, and then we would come in for 6 weeks. Half the crew would go on leave for 2 weeks, then the other half of the crew for 2 weeks. And then the last 2 weeks were sort of getting match fit again, training into the attack simulator and that sort of thing. But the captain was brand new. And because there was so much work to be done, I mean, we'd been pretty busy in the previous 6 months. We'd been to the United States. We'd done some firings, including torpedo firings. And we'd been operating in the Mediterranean as well. And so we needed that availability time to maintain the submarine. And we were doing it with plenty of shore support. But there were relatively few people on board. And some of them, myself, I was recently married. And so with relatively few officers on board, I was spending an awful lot of time on board, especially at nights. And we got the alert on the 1st of April. Now, clearly, we'd been watching the news, and the way in which everything had built up was that for some months beforehand, the Galtieri, the new president, who incidentally, while he was president, retained command of the army, which is an unusual circumstance. But he had heavily pumped up we want the Falklands back, even though the Falklands had technically never been a part of Argentina. They were agitating very strongly, especially with the United Nations, for it to return. And it started getting rather heavy at about the 19th of March, when a team of scrap metal people were given permission by the UK to go to South Georgia, where there were large numbers of old whaling ships and whaling establishments, largely made of steel, and these were scrap, and he had been given authority to lift them. Unfortunately, when he got there, they didn't go to Grytviken, where they were told to go, more of that later. Instead, he found himself with quite a large party of Argentine naval people who had raised a flag, and we had started to object to it. And that started the prolonged, or not very prolonged, but essentially 2 weeks of intense discussions between the UK, the United Nations, and Argentina, all of which, frankly, was resolved on the 2nd of April when the Argentine Marines landed. By that stage, though, we'd appreciated what was going on, and Conqueror was the 3rd submarine to be sent south. 2 of the S-class, rather faster, much newer, and furthermore with proper computer target motion analysis systems, had been sent south. One of them was already a little on the way there. She departed from Gibraltar, and HMS Splendid went from Faslane, where we were. And I was the officer of the day and had to recall the ship's company on the 1st of April. HMS Conqueror always had a fairly bouncy ship's company. And so ringing up myself and the chief of the boat, we call the coxswain, the troubled people down in Portsmouth, and we were not believed. And the coxswain came to me to say, "Sir, you'd never believe it, but they're not allowing us, or they're not believing us." So the simple answer was, "Well, have them arrested." And sure enough, they were arrested. They were brought by the police back to the boat. And that 50% of the crew were actually relatively significant, not least because we were going to have to head south pretty quickly. We also embarked SBS. Now, the SBS, the Special Boat Service, are essentially there's about 300 of them, and they are the special forces for the Navy. They're nearly all Royal Marines, although one or two naval officers and naval ratings have joined the SBS. But it was regarded as terribly secret that they were on board. They were delivered to us in the middle of the night. There were 8 or 9 of them. They were not allowed on the upper deck in daylight. They, of course, wanted to exercise and run around and do things, but they were not allowed to. We'd already embarked a lot of weapons, but the forward compartment, the fore ends, we call it, the torpedo room, the bomb shop, was absolutely full of canoes and guns and ammunition of variety of weapons which not normally carried on board a submarine. Of course, there were other things going on as well. We needed some briefings because all of our time in the Navy had been spent fighting the Cold War. We were used to an opponent who was essentially Russian, and we knew the threat and we knew the environment, but we did not know anything really much south of the equator. And we were going to be faced in Argentina with a mixture of American, French, British, local ships, none of which, other than the British perhaps, we knew much about. However, some years before, the Argentine had also started to agitate, and we sent our first nuclear submarine, HMS Dreadnought, all the way south, and she did an extended patrol down there of about 2 months in 1976. And so we did have some idea of the environmental state in the South Atlantic. And I, of course, as the navigator, was left to plan an 8,000-mile transit in about 4 days. And that was pretty much my principal occupation for the time. But imagine what it was like. We were going for an uncertain length of time. We had double-decked. That means that we had put lots of tinned food along the deck, secured it. And so when you walk down the main corridor in the forward part of the submarine, you could not stand upright. And we were fully loaded with people, fully loaded, except for trainees. We got rid of all our trainees. And the mood on board was interesting. There was a strong sense of doing something we'd always thought we would never do, which was go to war. And we never really believed that the politicians would have the guts to keep on with it. There was lots of saber rattling. There was lots of pictures of ships sailing or being put up on the news. But the feeling on board was that it's going to come to naught. It'll be just another bit of retreat from empire. The Argentine, once they've landed there, we won't be able to push them out. And indeed, that was the briefing which the Prime Minister had. And it was only the First Sea Lord himself in person who went to tell her that actually within a few days he could assemble the task force and they could be heading south. And it would take them 3 to 4 weeks to get there, but they could get there. But we weren't really in that, we weren't in the picture quite so much. Now, here is roughly, we did not go to Ascension. We went pretty much in a straight line from the Azores all the way down to roughly where the H of South is, and we were then diverted to South Georgia. But we sailed from Faslane on the 4th of April, and the captain then got his first opportunity to dive his submarine. Now, fortunately, he was brand newly promoted, I seem to remember, And he had previously been the second in command of Courageous, the sister ship of Conqueror. And so he was familiar with the boat, familiar with the way in which the boat handled. So perhaps it wasn't a huge challenge, but I'm very pleased it's never something I've been asked to do when in command, because we got into the deep water just outside the Clyde. Those of you who've operated off the Clyde will know that there are patches of water which are very nearly 1,000 feet deep, and frankly, there's an awful lot of it which isn't. But there we go. So we had an opportunity to dive the submarine, to shake it down, to establish re-establish the routines. Interestingly, the first lieutenant himself had only been on board for 3 or 4 months, but at least he'd been on board for a whole operating period. And once we'd shaken down, we carried out a very straightforward drill of firing a torpedo, or for exercise, firing a torpedo. And then we surfaced and started to make our way south. Now, the Irish Sea is quite shallow, so it's clearly better and faster and safer for a nuclear submarine to stay on the roof. We didn't dive until we were some distance to the south and west of Land's End. Funnily enough, we were... Sorry, somebody trying to speak something? I'll continue. We actually dived in sight of HMS Hermes, who was embarking aircraft. And that was quite a sight to see. And then we went deep and fast. And the standard routine of reading a broadcast every 8 hours was abandoned. The onus on ourselves, and indeed the other boats that were heading south, was to go there as quickly as possible. And so we essentially spent 22 hours a day flat out, and then 2 hours to clear stern arcs, return to periscope depth, receive the broadcast. And so for that hour or so that we were on the roof, we were dived, but we were capable of receiving signals. We would then take the broadcast, which essentially consisted of barnstorms, which were really quite detailed. There was an awful lot of information to convey to us. And at the same time, we had our normal jobs to do. I mean, I had received an awful lot of what we in the Royal Navy call collector sheets, which are essentially the raw data for making up charts. That's every sounding, every piece of land, every piece of information that they could put. So there was no color. And so I spent an awful lot of time coloring the charts in, so people knew instinctively that this was land and this was shallow water and this was deep water. And it was interesting going through some of the charts as well. The main chart that covered the gap, which is roughly 1,000 miles between South Georgia and the Falklands, was surveyed by a certain Lieutenant James Cook in 1774. And I'm pretty sure that he had no idea that 200 odd years later, the Royal Navy would be operating a nuclear submarine at depths down to significantly longer than any ship he served in, at speeds significantly greater than any ship he had served in. But there we are. That was something we had to think about. And we operated the echo sounder a great deal, almost continuously, in areas which were poorly charted. And my role essentially was to try and look at a chart like that and work out if there were any clues we could take. We also evolved a technique of coming shallow quickly and reversing course if we detected a pinnacle, which we did, and it worked. And the only other comment I make about the charts was that this was not an area where people had done a great deal of surveying, and the charts of the Falkland Islands themselves were pre-metric charts, so they were grey land as opposed to yellow. The sort of things we were used to just weren't there. And very encouragingly, across the top of the coast of East Falkland was the helpful message, land believed to lie 4.5 miles further south. In other words, it had all been fixed by people with sextant observations, and there was a degree of uncertainty. What it meant was that when you were navigating with respect to land, you were safe because you were fixing from the land if the land was in sight. Otherwise, your sat-nav error may well put you aground. One of the things you had to be careful about. And of course, we were going full power all the way and making a lot of noise. And one of my recollections is that somewhere off the coast of Brazil, we slowed down, and part of the drill we did on that particular day was to go active on our sonar, which was the 2001, a very powerful active sonar, which had first been sent to sea in the mid-1950s. It was also quite a good passive sonar, but we made a detection of what was probably a submarine at some huge range off Brazil, far too far away for us to worry about. So we stopped and went on south. But we were making a lot of noise. It was not a particularly covert trap south. Now, we also came across some communications issues. As we approached the equator, the satellites from which we were receiving the Sussex broadcast were higher and higher in the sky. Clearly they were. And our antenna was not very good at receiving signals from anything higher than about 70 degrees. And one of the things we used to do was to try and adopt a bow up or bow down angle, depending which way we were from the equator, in order to receive the Sussex broadcast, which is a much cleaner and quicker way of receiving signals. Because we were also suffering because the distance from the British low frequency transmission station in the middle of England was now so great that it became unreliable. And when we were further south, we also lost our UHF aerial, although we learned once we got down to South Georgia that our transmissions could be received through the damaged aerial, but the signal strength that we were receiving was simply insufficient, which we solved by having a new communications track from New Zealand. But I must repeat what I said earlier, just to emphasize the mood on board. Yes, it was an adventure. Yes, we were doing something different, but frankly, going flat out for 6 hours is a very dull way of spending the watch. Yes, there was plenty to do, but the mood on board, the discussions that you would have in the back of the control room, with the engineer going on watch and things like that, those discussions were not particularly optimistic. There was a real sense that we would reach a point where the politicians would put their hands up, we go to surrender stations, turn around and come back north again. But when we arrived off South Georgia on the 19th of April, things changed. And let me describe how they changed. It's probably fair to say that it was very satisfying for me to be able to call the captain one day and say, "Captain, sir, land ho." And bless him, he didn't say, "Come on, pilot, which particular piece of land?" We all knew that we were heading for South Georgia, and South Georgia is extremely mountainous. And through the periscope, I could see 3 mountains, which told us that we were some distance to the north. And those of you not familiar with South Georgia, it's a long mountain chain in the middle of the ocean. It's a little over 100 miles from top to bottom. There are settlements there, but they're nearly all abandoned. Grytviken is the headquarters of the British Antarctic mission at the moment, but it wasn't then. There were 2 ladies on board, on Bird Island. They were counting penguins or something, and they were rather surprised when a British helicopter turned up one day and delivered them a couple of sidearms, just in case the Argentine decided to be ghastly in their direction. But there we are. But what happened between landfall and actually going into Grytviken was really a game changer as far as we were concerned. We made a detection of a classic submarine signature. Now, we were at this stage allowed to engage submarines. And here was what, if I refer to 2 pence high, I mean, we had burnt paper traces on this sonar, and the high you would get a bearing accuracy of about 2 degrees. And so very quickly you could work out by watching the bearing rate whether this was a submarine close or far or slow, and we could hear Diesel's signature on the bearing. So we stood the watch to, called the captain, closed up, returned to periscope depth relatively quickly, imagining that because the bearing rate was moving, that this chap would be close. We thought he would be snorting. But as we came to the surface, the periscope went up, nothing was in sight. We'd also lost the contact. We did various things. We came very shallow. We actually stuck the fin out at the top of the water. So the height of eye of the periscope was of the order of 45, 50 feet. But we could not see the submarine. So he was clearly further away than we thought. Or he'd pulled the mast down and was now at some intermediate range from us, but on main motors, i.e. relatively silent. So we went deep and fast. We went beyond where we thought he was, turned round, listened, saw nothing, transmitted, got no response. I now know, because I met the navigator, that they were on the surface and fast. Now, this particular submarine was a World War II American submarine, modernized. It was a Guppy 2 or 3. And with 4 engines, she could do 22 knots on the surface. She was elderly, but still a viable threat to us. And if you can see, the brown line at the top is the passage which the Santa Fe followed. And she went into Grytviken and deposited some troops and supplies, and then came out to be greeted by, of all things, a British helicopter. And the captain elected to stay on the roof, which was a gutsy move, but he thought he could see torpedoes. And he realized that if he was to dive, he would then be sufficiently deep for the torpedoes to engage him. So he stayed on the surface. I believe he did not intend to engage the helicopter with gunfire. But the helicopter dropped 2 depth charges, one of which fell onto his after casing, rolled into the water, and exploded very close to his 2 propellers and started the seals. So now he was in a sinking submarine. They could not control the influx of water. And so gradually the submarine was topping up. So he reversed course, went maximum speed, and headed back towards Grytviken, where he was engaged again by another helicopter, which fired an AS-11 or AS-12 missile, which didn't actually explode until it had passed through the fin. But it did take the leg off the lookout. And the navigating officer who I met in San Diego when I was running a planning exercise for a submarine rescue thing, he and I were introduced, and I think we both had the same thoughts, what if? Because if we got close to him, we would have fired at him, and he may well have had a go at us. And that is what changed the mood on board, and it was quite tangible. We sharpened up very, very quickly. There was still sort of humor in what we did, but we just became much more sharp. We realized that suddenly we were not going to turn around and go home. And we were going to find ourselves in a shooting war because the shooting had started. And indeed, we went into, not into Grytviken, but just around the corner above where it says Grytviken, where the water was remarkably deep. And that's where we unloaded our SBS people, all their guns. We actually had a guy fall in the water, which was rather distressing. The temperature of the water was barely above freezing. And he was really in quite a bad way and was taken to a British warship for a recovery process. We also stayed in the area of South Georgia for a little while because the issue for us was principally the communications problems. But having got rid of the forces, having repaired as much as we could, we headed towards the south of the Falkland Islands to what was going to be our future station. And we had to deploy our floating wire aerial, which is essentially a 600-foot long aerial, which you have to be pretty close to the surface for it to work. But that was now our principal link to the world through an HF link in New Zealand. And we started to see the first indications of stress in the crew. I'll quote 2 particular examples because They both struck me at the time as being really quite serious. The first was one of the older senior ratings, chief petty officer, who was a panel watchkeeper. He was part of the controller of how the submarine is kept on depth, pumping and flooding, and just the general running of the trim of the submarine. And he started to get very panicky. And if there was any argument, he would often stand up and join in. For God's sake, listen to the officer, we could all be killed, was one of the more helpful things he said in the control room while I was there. And so we had to start treating him differently. And we shouldn't underestimate the power that having a panicky bloke like that in the control room does affect you. We couldn't get rid of him. We couldn't land him because we were on the bare bones of our crew. So we had to take time. We had to find out what kept him calm. And essentially it was discussing with him. Occasionally you would just go and put your hand on his shoulder. How are things, Chief? What's this? What's the contents of this tank? Or show an interest in what he was doing. At one stage, we gave him permission to smoke continuously. He was a heavy smoker, and that seemed to steady him as well. And even at periscope depth, every now and then, a lit cigarette would pass through the curtains and then be given to him. And we managed him. I mean, I have to say that since then he's passed away, but I won't mention names and anything, but I bumped into him since, and I don't think he ever really recovered from the experience. The other that I like to quote was a young man, a stoker, that's a machinist mate, I suppose is the equivalent, whose action station was the motor room. That's the conical after end of the submarine. And initially he was there by himself with the door locked, not knowing what we were doing, not knowing how long he was going to have to stay in there. And he started to get a bit sort of worried and morose, and the engineers back aft noticed this. And it was one of the things one of the useful things perhaps we discussed on board. What are we going to do about people like this? And essentially they changed how the watches work back there. So he was never alone. There were always two guys locked up in that compartment. There was always a briefing for the engineer going on watch, so who had to pass through the control room. And the engineer would also brief us on what was going on back aft. So we formalized things which perhaps we should have been doing anyway. And to a degree we were, but we made it much more important. The officer of the watch from the control room, who did a set of rounds of the submarine at the end of the work of the watch, was encouraged to go and speak to people in the galley, people in the forends, people in maneuvering, people in the spaces back aft. And we put charts up so that people could see where we were and what we were doing. What we were doing was classified, but not quite as much as some of the things we've done in the past. And we managed it. And interestingly, the young stoker, I regret I can't remember his name, but he's still with us. He did recover, and he did become much more at ease with what he was doing. And he wasn't the only case, but we started to manage this. And it is my recollection that we didn't really do it until we suddenly found people getting a bit wobbly. But let's go back to the war. The situation that we found ourselves as we did the transit from South Georgia to south of the Falklands, which is about 1,000 miles. We ended up stationed roughly about halfway down the Big Blue Arrow from the Birdwood Bank. And the tactical situation which had emerged was that there were essentially three little groups of Argentine forces. One American to the south, which was the Belgrano, with two Allen M. Sumner destroyers. Can't remember the names. And, oh yes, I can. No, but I can't remember their American names. And then to the north, there was the former British aircraft carrier, a light fleet carrier, about 16,000 tons, quite small, but with A4s embarked, and also anti-submarine tracker aircraft, the Viento Cinco de Mayo. And she was escorted by two British or one Argentine built, one British built, Type 42 anti-aircraft destroyers, identical pretty much to the ones we had in the task group. And there were also 2 or 3 French sort of light frigates, all with, again, all named after personnel who were significant to the Argentine. And of course, the various air stations, Rio Grande, Rio Gallegos, San Juan, were already starting overflights of the Falklands, and indeed, even as far as Ascension, some thousands of miles to the north. Boeing 707, Argentine Boeing 707, had been sent and was dissuaded from getting any close by launch of a Harrier at pretty much short notice. But this is the start. I mean, the British task force orientated itself to the north and east of East Falkland, and that's where the 2 carriers were. And HMS Splendid was generally, no, HMS Spartan was generally in their area. HMS Splendid was tasked to look for the carrier, but although she got lots of sniffs, she never actually established a fire control solution on the carrier. And we were down south just in case the Belgrano crossed the Birdwood Bank, which was relatively shallow. Frankly, I think the shallowness of the Birdwood Bank is a little overstated. But it was down there that we made a detection. And the detection is worth a little bit of thinking about. This is on the 30th of April. And what we made a detection on the towed array was a strong, slow-speed diesel signature, classic signature of a large merchant vessel. We had to resolve the bearing, and the bearing was somewhere to the south of west. And the classic signature of a large tanker, nothing on broadband. So, as this was an area where merchant vessel traffic was unusual, I mean, no tanker would go around the Cape Horn when it could go through the canal. So we started a sprint and drift, going quite quickly for a few hours and slowing down and having a good listen, opening the arcs of the towed array until we made broadband contact with the bow array. For those of you who are not submariners, broadband contact is important because you get much better bearing accuracy. And it is by analyzing how the bearing changes without coming shallow that you can make judgments on how fast your target is moving, what course it's steering, how far away it is. And this is sort of second nature to submariners. But eventually we achieved broadband contact and we kept closing until we'd identified we've got a large number of contacts, at least 4 contacts. And so during one of my watches, we came to periscope depth with the captain in the control room. I don't think we were at action stations, but we were certainly, the whole watch was closed up. This is a tense moment. And the captain put the periscope up, very calmly, swept all the way around, put the periscope down. Now the captain's very quietly spoken. So when he was about to speak, everybody shut up and listened. And in fact, it was a good tactic, I think. And he said, 4 ships in sight, tanker plus 3 warships. I can't tell them apart. Now, this set my little heart a beating because I am and always have been a ship spotter. And I was known for it. So the captain allowed me to have the next look, which as I was, first time I'd ever looked at an enemy warship, frankly, other than the Russians. And I was able to identify the cruiser and the 2 destroyers, and also made some observations. They were not rotating radar antennae. They were going relatively slowly. They didn't appear to be doing very much. There were no sonar transmissions. And I now know why, but I mean, more of that in a minute. I mean, and we remained very close to them, having opened to report contact and then re-established close contact. And we stayed right astern of the Belgrano, although there was a little bit of changing. And funnily enough, one of the destroyers and the Belgrano had very similar signatures. But I now know that was because they weren't propelling on all shafts. They were deliberately trying to look like fishing boats. When I say look like, I mean actually to a sonar. And actually it's worth having a look at this picture of the Belgrano. One of the things that's said about the Belgrano is that she might have had Exocet missiles. There's no evidence of it, but there is a little box just there, which looks remarkably like an Exocet missile. But there we go. But this is the Belgrano in happier days, making no transmissions, keeping to a moderate speed. I now know she was operating on a single shaft. She had no zigzag plan, although we had observed zigzags, but they were probably our own errors in estimation. But having had dinner a few years ago with the gunnery officer of the Belgrano in my club in London, I now know that they were deliberately trying not to look like warships. And frankly, they were making a reasonable stab at it. Unfortunately for them, they were operating in a part of the world where, frankly, any ship was likely to be investigated by a submarine. It's also worth pointing out that the Belgrano was a very popular ship. Guys within the Argentine Navy all went to serve on this ship as part of their training crews, whether they were ratings or officers. So she was a ship that was loved, and I believe she was very comfortable. But we were now anticipating that we were going to get a change of rules of engagement. And we had to discuss what sort of torpedo we were going to use. Remember what I said earlier about the ship? She was armored. She was going to be a handful. And we had two types of torpedo on board. We had the Mark 8 torpedo. Okay, it was the mod 4 of the Mark 8. But this torpedo had first come into British service in 1932. So we were essentially celebrating the weapon's 50th birthday. Relatively short range, 5,000 yards. That was the limit of the tables that you had in the book. But the weapon would probably run 2.5 times that distance before it ran out of oomph. You could control depth to between 6 and 44 feet in 2-foot steps. The weapon went at 48 knots. I mean, you can read as well as I can. It had a nice big warhead. It was very, very reliable. Although, funnily enough, a war shot we'd fired the previous year failed to explode, but did sink the old trawler that we were sinking. And the weapons we had on board were actually manufactured in 1943. Why I remember that, I don't know, but it is how I remember it. And the Tigerfish Mod 1 was the second attempt to make an electric, or the second mod of the Mark II, so Mod 0, Mod 1, which had a wire guidance up to about 15,000 yards. And the battery would continue to run for 26,000 yards, which is what? Just over 13 nautical miles. You could control it from 25 down to 1,400 feet. It wasn't particularly fast, but it wasn't particularly slow. It was very quiet, but it had a triflingly small warhead. Superb for tackling a submarine, but for a warship, a bit less so. And we had real problems with the reliability of this weapon. The wire was constantly breaking, and I can remember doing firings, not just on Conqueror, but on other submarines as well, where virtually every time you fired a torpedo, before it had gone 1,000 yards, the wire broke. And because it was an exercise, the torpedo was always told to surface once the wire had broken. So we never got to examine how the torpedo behaved near a target. Now, this is very similar to the experience the American Navy had in 41, 42 with the Mark 14 torpedo, which had not been properly trialed. This weapon had not been properly trialed. And one of the killer facts was that this constant failure of the wire meant that another failure, the inability of the fuse to work 100%, was concealed from us. Now, after the Falklands, we spent a lot of money getting it right. And the Tigerfish Mod 2 was an absolutely excellent torpedo. Still in use, I think, in the Chilean and possibly the Turkish Navy. But it's a good anti-submarine weapon and not a bad weapon for tackling an escort. But we clearly, faced with a World War II cruiser, with a World War II weapon with a nice big warhead, we opted for the Mark 8. And there is a Mark 8, mostly air cylinder, screws and run at the back, a little diesel engine here, and the pistol, which actually fired the warhead there. The Tigerfish, almost exactly the same size, but very different in appearance. Cold War weapon, designed principally for anti-submarine. The anti-ship use was secondary, very stealthy, but all the problems I described. So let's look at the attack itself. This is a rather hastily contrived map of the final maneuvers of the task group 79, which was the Belgrano group. And we had followed them from somewhere well to the west off the Isla de los Estados. And they had generally been tracking at this moderate speed, without radar, without sonar, towards the general area to the north of the East Falklands, where the task group was. Now, we had cracked some Argentine codes, and we were aware that south of the total exclusion zone was this circular exercise area, diameter about 10 miles, and the group went through it. Now, the captain found himself in a position to attack, but actually, because what they did was they doubled back through, we had to go again. And the perfect position for an attack against a ship like this is on the beam with what is called a zero GA shot. So in other words, the torpedoes come out and steer the same course as the submarine. To do that is relatively straightforward. All you have to do is make sure that the position at which you take your final bearing is also the same angle as the deflection angle required for the torpedoes to meet the torpedo, sorry, to meet the ship. I've often, as navigator, been asked how far outside we were. Well, when we actually sank the ship, we were 37 nautical miles outside the exclusion zone, which some politicians made a big issue of. But essentially, that's what we did. And what was she doing? Well, we formed an opinion that she was probably delousing, i.e. taking the task group and possibly any submarine that was following through a sonar buoy field. And indeed, we did find some sonar buoys later on. But we got ourselves into position. We were on the beam. We had the perfect position. It was a perfect approach. It was an astonishingly crisp drill. And the captain was putting the periscope up and down to take the bearing, estimated range, estimated angle on the bow. So I on the plot could work out the course, the range, whether it was a coherent, consistent track we had of the target, which we did have. And then the captains put the periscope up for what should be the final time. Final target setup, cut the bearing, was about to say fire when the first lieutenant shouted out, "Do not fire," which is a relatively unusual thing to hear during a torpedo attack. But the gyro angle was improving. We were going too soon. So the periscope came down. Everybody understood pretty much immediately what had happened. The first lieutenant was watching the tracking computer, the electromechanical computer, gave the nod for the periscope to go up. Captain put the periscope up, cut the bearing, fire. And then the first torpedo was fired. And then 3 seconds later, the second, and then the next. And the captain then continued to wait. It was safe to do so because the destroyers were on the other side of the ship from us. We were down here, somewhere firing to the north. And the attack went swimmingly well. I mean, the zero GA shot was the idea. I think that the weapons went 2 right, 0, 3 left. It was brilliant. You always fire from stern to bow. And the range on firing was less than 1,200 yards, which is, I think, a bit closer than he anticipated going for. Now, there is the Belgrano, and these 2 little arrows. And the captain put the periscope up. The first torpedo struck here, pretty much in the engine room, and below the dining hall where the ship's company had gathered for their briefing. And one of the questions the gunnery officer asked me was, did we deliberately fire at that point, at that time, in order to have the greatest effect on the crew numbers? And of course, the answer is no. I mean, we fired 3 torpedoes, expecting 1 hit. We got 2. The other torpedo struck here and removed the bow. Now, another interesting thing is that the gunnery officer was asleep in his cabin somewhere in this main superstructure, sleeping naked. Now, the reason I make this point is that the British ship in war, you would no more dream of taking your clothes off than flying in the air. I mean, you probably didn't even take your shoes off. I mean, if you had wet clothing, you'd take that off, but you would sleep ready to go. And so the weapons hit, the lights went out. He was scrabbling around looking for clothing. The ship was starting to heal. And he did eventually make it into a life raft. And I've showed him this picture, and he believes that was the life raft he was in, because it ended up being caught on the damaged bow and ripped to pieces and in a sinking condition. So he and the other 11 people in that had then to swim in water temperature of about 37 F. So this is kill you water, and actually make it to a nearby raft where they were picked up from some 24 hours later. Pretty remarkable. And we then opened range, and when we came up again, some distance away, we found the destroyer zigzagging towards us. There was no clue as to why. Perhaps it was those sonar boys, but we then went deep and fast. And the captain came to the back of the control room, and I opened a copy of Jane's. And so, sir, for the record, where did the torpedoes hit again? And the captain looked at me, and that very quiet voice of his just said very quietly, pilot. Captains always call their navigators pilot. Pilot, I don't sink cruisers every day. And he looked at me, you know, like you would look at an over inquisitive child. So I put the book away. But there we go. But the immediate effect, the Argentine Navy went home. There's some evidence that one or two of their submarines stayed around, but we had established local control. The only reinforcement and route now was via the air, and it essentially eliminated the threat of surface action against our carriers and amphibious ships. The long-term effects of the war itself, well, very much it restored the reputation of UK arms. And I believe the UK-US relationship was significantly strengthened. Soviet attitudes changed. I think there probably was a Russian submarine down there, but I don't know that. I think it very likely that they were surprised that we were resolute. They expected us to be sort of effete Western decadent fools and to give a very poor account of ourselves. How surprised they were. Of course, also the Navy was justified and saved from emasculation and to the benefit of Argentina. And perhaps the only reason for fighting the war to some people, the Argentine junta fell and democracy was restored. And I, of course, got to go home. And on the 4th of July, I met my wife and daughter. I'd met my wife before, but the daughter was brand new. She had been born while I was in the South Atlantic. And that, gentlemen, is all I've got to say. I've actually gone on for even longer than usual. That was an hour and 5 minutes, for which all I can do really is apologize.
No apology needed. Outstanding. Thank you, Jonti.
Fantastic, Jonti.
Okay,
Well,
Jonti,
good.
do you have time for some questions?
Well, can I just quickly go through those that are on chat?
Certainly.
Jim has asked, is Stuart Preble's book, Secrets of the Conqueror, fully reliable? I'm afraid I simply can't answer that question. But it's a good book. Ian asked, analog fire control systems in 1980. Yep, that's absolutely right. But it worked. Conqueror was the last of our nuclear submarines to be modified. We had a partial analog. Oh, yes. Okay. Ian Franks. If Galtieri had delayed the invasion by 6 months, by which time Intrepid, Hermes, and several other ships would not have been, that's absolutely the truth. The Falklands War saved the Navy. And of course, I don't often say nice things about Tony Blair, but his 1997 plan to have a rational defense review and 2 carriers and new amphibious ships and involve DFID, the foreign aid people, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as well as defense, about what we wanted our Navy to be capable of doing was rational. And actually, I think we're reaping the benefit of that. And the range, when the shots were taken, as I say, it depends whether it was the first torpedo that hit her or the second. It was probably the second, in which case I believe the range was just inside 1,100 yards. And yes, San Luis did fire on British warships, but one of the things was that the hull-down aircraft carrier, Invincible, and the hull-down Type 42 looked very, very similar. They had the same shafts and blades, they had the same radars, they had the same sonar. So it'd be very difficult to tell the difference. There is some anecdotal evidence that HMS Glasgow, one of our Type 42s, did have a torpedo fired at her. Are there any other questions? Pleased to take them.
Yeah, I had Dave Evans, San Diego. San Clemente. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I was on a unitized trip before the war, and one of the stops was Porto Belgrano, where we had the opportunity after operating with her to tour the Belgrano and actually had a quite nice party on board. One of the things that when you talked about charts, my experience was even the US Navy charts were not that good below the equator, and I used mostly Brazilian charts for that part of the trip.
Yeah, so did we.
The other thing to mention is you talked about noise. Fast forward about 4 years later, I was on a missile patrol in the Atlantic and got an urgent message that said, please move to the western part of your patrol area. And because there was a British warship going to go by rather quickly, and a few hours later, we heard you go by. And you were cranking, you were doing 25 knots plus easily. But I thought it interesting how easily it was to pick you up. But nonetheless, when any of us are going that fast, we tend to produce a little bit of noise.
Jonti, did the captain have the authority to fire, or did he have to get it from London first?
No, we were limited on by rules of engagement. So rules of engagement essentially is like a two-tier system. The first tier is essentially 3 issues. Are you allowed, are you maintaining the status quo? Are you increasing activity or reducing activity? And then the second section is detailed one, what you're allowed to shoot, where you're allowed to go. And generally that really hinges on whether it's escalate, de-escalate, or status quo. So we had instructions to engage any submarine that was not nuclear, and also to engage any warship within the total exclusion zone. And so we had, Belgrano was outside, so we had actually to change the rules. Now, and there's a bit of a debate here because Sandy Woodward, the Admiral, actually sent us a signal to say sink the Belgrano, which he's not allowed to do. But he did that in order to sort of stick a red hot poker up the backside of the officer in the headquarters to make him appreciate that we were about to start a shooting war and they needed to change the rules. And I think the rules changed, probably within 4 hours of the attack. In fact, I've got here the patrol report. I could probably find out exactly when we received the signal. But signals, as I said, were a problem, and we were literally cutting and pasting huge, great waths of paper in order to get a single coherent message. But that's the way it was in the 1980s, especially as we were effectively in a 1950s submarine.
Johnny?
Yeah, Denver.
Thank you very much for an outstanding discussion and a lecture. I would also like to say what I told the fellows who were on here earlier that I knew Sandy. when he used to come to my house and have a drink up in Faslane. I also was executive officer of the Catfish before it became the Australian ship. I mean the Argentinian ship.
Oh, interesting.
And so I haven't gone to the Falklands to see my old ship, but I understand it's up on the beach there where you can look at it. Do you happen to know if it's still there?
No, it wasn't. It was beached.
The helicopter killed it, of course.
Yeah, we did try and recover it. The captain of HMS Brilliant, which is one of the frigates that was there, a famous submariner, unfortunately now dead, a chap called John Coward.
Oh, yeah.
He advised that he thought that the submarine could be refloated. Unfortunately, very few people spoke Spanish. Nobody knew the inner workings of this ex-American submarine. And an Argentine petty officer touched the wrong handle and was shot dead by the Royal Marine Guard. He did what he was told to do. So eventually the ship was towed by one of the rescue tugs into deep water and sunk. Frankly, I think it would have been much better if they'd brought her back to the UK and put her on the bottom in a submarine exercise area as a target. But there we go.
Thank you again, sir. And thank the Washington DC. Tim, I want to thank you for putting this together too.
I'm glad you enjoyed
You're
it.
right, it was the Catfish.
Yeah, it was.
So I just looked at 1974, James.
Yeah, it was. And as past president of the Pacific Southwest chapter of the Naval Submarine League, I really appreciate what you've done. Thank you. I'm done. Thank you.
I have to ask a
Right.
question of one person. Chris, do you have anything you want to add?
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris. I was actually the captain at the time. I kept quiet. It was Jonti's presentation to you, and I thought it was fantastic. I haven't heard him speak before, and I would say what he said was about 99-point-something% of how I recall it all. So he certainly knew more about the morale of the ship's company at the beginning than I did. And that was fascinating. Now I've got nothing else to say. The rules of engagement were very clear to us throughout, and as Jonti says, and they were changed at about 14:30 that afternoon, when we, not just us, all the submarines down there, received a signal that authorized us to attack any Argentinian warships or auxiliaries south of the equator, basically. So that allowed us, who were in contact at the time, to carry out the attack.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. You trained Jonti well.
As he told you at the beginning, I was new on board. I think he and the others trained me, probably.
Well said.
I do remember one thing which I talk about. He described the attack and after the attack, and my memory is that having seen the hits, we went deep and started to evade fast to the east because of the two destroyers. I calmly ordered action reload for torpedoes, and as soon as we put on about half a degree of angle, either up or down or left or right, the fore end started whimpering, so we had to stop that. When we slowed down 6,000 yards from the datum, we heard, I think Jonti said, we heard some explosions. So I decided we'd continue to evade to the east at speed. And I always say, looking around my control room, that was one of the best command decisions I made as far as the ship's company present thought.
Great, thanks for that insight. Thank everybody for attending, and very much, Jonti, we appreciate you doing this as a repeat, so we get a chance to record it. We'll have it up on the NSL website somewhere in the next week or so.
Bravo, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Very illuminating and interesting on many levels.
Yeah.
George, can I say something?
Certainly.
Yeah, George, on to Jonti. We crossed paths many years ago, 1995. You were at the British Embassy, and I was at the Naval Sea Systems Command. and I was a program manager for submarines research and development. And we established a UK-US technical exchange. So we met a couple times and we went across the pond back and forth. You came and I went over there. So it's good to see you again, and very nice presentation.
Thank you.
Can I say one thing?
Sure.
I'm a civilian. I work closely with things that I'm not supposed to discuss, but just looking at all the people down here who are obviously either serving or ex-serving, I just want to say on behalf of myself, as someone who now benefits from, shall we say, naval activity, thank you very much to all of those of you who risk your lives for the security of mine and my own family. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Nick, you're welcome. Yes, indeed.
I'll see you on Tuesday, Jonty.
Okay, then. Yes. See you on Tuesday.
Jonti, excellent show. Chris, nice to see you. I congratulate you on your command decisions. They are never easy to make, and you seem to make all the right ones. Well done, sir.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to drop this off now. And join us next time. We'll get the information out on when our next meeting is and who the speaker will be. Thank you.
Yeah, before we shut it down, just to say, remember my email. I'll be happy to answer questions in slow time after the event.
If you didn't write that down, drop me a line and I'll be happy to send it to you.
Okay, everybody. Thanks for listening and good day.
Yep. Thanks, Johnny.
Bye.
All the best.
Jonti.
Thank you very much.